Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Podcast. We are second time in the new year and we're full complement. My name is Jos Bortaj. I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare magazine, and with me are Murray Dahm, the assistant editor of Ancient Warfare, Mark DeSantis, Lindsay Powell, and Mark McCaffrey. Today we decided we'd talk about revolutions in ancient warfare, which once we put out the questions, the question to our patron community, generated quite a few questions that I'm not sure we can get all to today, and it's a big topic that we can talk about uh, probably more than once, so we might even do that. But to start us off, I thought we start with one of those questions. It's patron Russell, and he said, maybe from a larger perspective, do we have examples where an established, that's to say, an old technology, artfully utilized, won out over a new, eventually superseding technology that was poorly employed in its infancy, because new systems always have development problems? So we're going straight for systems, not technologies, but more of a complex idea. And we were pre-discussing like we always do. And I think Mark had a suggestion that will probably spin us off for the next 20 minutes or so.
In terms of, I was pitching the idea about Macedonians in terms of thinking about the introduction of the revolutionized Macedonian phalanx, as most people sort of associate it with Alexander the Great. But then, of course, then you can get into that lovely argument of, well, whatever Alexander did, he was doing off the back of what his dad, Philip II, established in Macedon. And of course, Philip is sort of taking charge of a Macedon, which when he comes to the helm of this small kingdom at the time, he has to make a huge change in terms of what the Macedonian army is. Up until then, there's a relatively decent cavalry wing, which is sort of their more traditional element. But really, in terms of infantry, that is where they're lacking. And they take apparently inspiration from the Theban phalanx and the organization that Philip has seen there, and at the same time revolutionize the idea of the weapon that they're going to use, rather than the Greek spear, the dory, that they're going to take on a much longer style spear, the sarissa. But then again, you get into the argument of Philip gets lots and lots of credit for this, but does he deserve it? Is he working off something that actually was already in pre-production, maybe already before that? His brother Perdiccas had already started seemingly to make some changes in terms of the Macedonian organization. Did this include the infantry? Well, we're not really sure. If it was, his first outing against the Illyrians was not exactly great, because he ends up dead, and much of the Macedonian phalanx with him. And then that brings in Philip. But is he working with absolutely original ideas, which reorganizes the phalanx, re-equips it with the sarissa and a smaller shield than the traditional Greek aspis? We really don't know. But if you go along with the traditional line, he does get all the credit.
The difficulty here, I guess, is are we talking about a new system that just sort of springs fully formed into history, which is, I think we talked about that last time. We like to sort of find these points in time, like poof, the introduction of the Macedonian phalanx, but it seems to have been a process.
It might get more credit than it's worth in terms of this revolution, but at the same time, Philip goes ahead and expands massively over the course of his early reign, taking in these other areas, which in turn bring in other elements of an army that eventually, by the time you get to the Battle of Chaeronea, in which he really presses forward his dominance over the traditional Greek phalanx. He's got an army that consists of a solid phalanx, a Macedonian phalanx, I should say, supported by the cavalry, which actually, when you look at Alexander, it is more a cavalry army, really. Possibly, again, the revolution of the phalanx is over-egged. And he's also got mixed units in terms of working with those cavalry and bringing in new types of troops, such as these Thracians. And
the interesting thing about Alexander, he does nothing new with the cavalry. It's nothing revolutionary. he uses them to the utmost of their potential. And I think the other thing about revolutions is it the first iteration? Is it this is the revolution, but it fails and it then gets redesigned, refiddled with, and nuanced, and then it becomes revolutionary. I mean, the sources credit Philip with the invention of the phalanx, and a lot of the no, we need to credit it to Anne Alexander, who is another earlier generation, but it's very vague and it's a very liminal source. It's not the main sources, Plutarch, Diodorus, they credit Philip, as do the Tactica manuals. So it's an interesting one in terms of, did he inherit something which he then finessed to make it into a machine that could dominate Greece and the world? In which case, where does the revolution happen? One of the other things, of course, about the phalanx is that we regard the sarissa as this exceptionally long two-handed pike. No ancient source mentions that as being particularly noteworthy. And we've got these reforms of Iphicrates that a lot of people like to mention as whether they're skeptical about them or not. But he apparently, according to one interpretation, doubles the length of the dory, which gets it very close to the length of a sarissa, which means by the time of Chaeronea, no one mentions the long sarissas of the Macedonians because, well, if they've been dealing with twice as long spears for 50 years, they wouldn't be noteworthy. We see it as that's a revolution. And you're like, well, there's a lot of things that came before that revolution. And in fact, there's a lot of things that come after that revolution. So where does the revolution happen exactly? And I think, as Jasper was saying, we like to latch upon a moment. And there are many in ancient warfare where it's this person, this consulship, or this date, and that's when it all happens, as opposed to the very boring, it's a process, and by this point X was happening, and after that point Y was happening. But what is that point? So it's
then it's same famous dates in history, the attack on the Bastille, even that arguably that doesn't come out of nothing either. I mean, the French Revolution traditionally starts at that date, but
anniversaries are a problem. Yeah.
Exactly. Just to continue Russell's question, is there an example of the phalanx, Macedonian phalanx, meeting a Greek phalanx and being defeated early on, or is Chaeronea the first real example we have where they meet, and then it's
Onomarchus of Phocis defeats Philip II of Macedon twice. Onomarchus is not, poor old Onomarchus never gets mentioned. He's called the Phocian Achilles in contemporary sources, and he defeats Philip twice, and that defeat is kind of whitewashed by Philip's later victories over the rest of the Greeks, especially the Athenians and the Thebans at Chaeronea.
But again, is that the Macedonian phalanx? Because if you look at the Macedonian phalanx later on, especially in the age of Alexander, I know I'm going into Alexander's lifetime rather than Philip's, but by that stage, actually, the different phalanx units seem to be in line with the different elements of the Macedonian state in terms of the uplands of Macedonia and versus the lowlands of Macedonia, each different, what may have been like a precursor kingdom that Philip had earlier on taken over. Each of them seems to provide a particular phalanx unit. Now, was that the case back in early Philip's reign? Are we looking at, again, it depends on when all this develops. Is that too early in Philip's reign to evaluate it as the proper?
Well, it seems to be, because if you go back to his officer corps, his commanders of the taxace of the phalanx, they all come from the region from which that taxus has been recruited. There's a couple under Alexander, there's a couple who are like, did you intermarry because you're commanding this one, but then you command that one, and they're different. And we don't have the six. We don't have the names of the six. I think we've got the names of three, and some of them are combined. Onestus and, I can't remember the other name, but they're a combined one. So I think so. I think it's part of the reform. And there's a really peculiar parallel that isn't particularly well documented, which is, of course, when Philip supports Alexander of Epirus to become king, he reforms the Epirot kingdom along the same lines as he's reformed the Macedonian kingdom. And then, again, no real evidence of it. In 334, at the same time as Alexander's invading Persia, Alexander of Epirus invades Italy, presumably with an Epirot phalanx, the same model of Philip's Macedonian phalanx. So it's kind of a two-way invasion, and he dies very quickly. And so there's no Macedonian invasion of Italy until Pyrrhus of Epirus. Yeah, it's a peculiar one because we focus on Alexander. It's like, well, meanwhile in the West, you got destroyed at the first outing, and weren't revolutionary, and you weren't taking over the world with this phalanx. Whereas in the East, in Alexander, you've got this idea that this new invention, which by that point it's not, it's a tried and true invention, and it's being refined to be an amazing machine by that point. And so it's that. Yeah, when did the revolution happen? Is it the thought? Is it the planning? Is it the putting into action? Or is it the, now that we've actually field tested it and lost, we'll make some tweaks, and this is now the revolution?
Well, I suspect it's that old adage of necessity is the mother of invention, right? So you find yourself in a difficult spot, and someone says, "Follow me," and it works or it doesn't work.
But is that revolution? No, it's not kind of.
Well, well, this is very interesting because there's that turning point, which is to say, an invention, innovation can be that significant that we label it revolution. And to Jasper's point about the French Revolution, there are lots of other inflection points that predate that, but historians love to be able to sort of give a label to this is the point at which everything changed. And of course, we're dealing with a literature which is not complete. And a lot of it, of course, the historians are not really interested in the minutiae and detail of military warfare. This stuff flies right over. And we were, I wish you'd said more about that battle, because we think, and that's why we enjoy doing it, because we can interpret everything we like in that space. But revolutions are kind of like a big word, isn't it? I mean, it suggests it sweeps everything that was before. And I think what we are talking about is really incremental innovations, because the fundamental issue of battle doesn't really change that much. It's massed forces against another massed force. If they're arranged in different lines, okay. A revolution would be, for example, I'm thinking you bring like artillery to the battle space, or you change up the way you use cavalry against an infantry formation. That's where I think the revolutions are.
Well, I was going to say the example that I'd go to would be in terms of the Mycenaeans. In terms of the Mycenaeans are much more, warfare dominated, but they're coming after the Minoans in terms of in the Aegean space. And of course, the Minoans are not if you look at all their art, if you look at their literature, warfare is not as key to their culture as it is for the Mycenaeans. And of course, why are the Mycenaeans bringing in, this knowledge of warfare? They're trying to keep up with the neighbors of the Egyptians and Hittites, etc. That's a revolution in terms of the introduction of that style of warfare from the Eastern Mediterranean into the Aegean. As an example.
Just for the viewers at home, you mean Mycenaeans, right?
Mycenaeans.
Mycenaeans, Cicero, Cicero, they're all the same guy. Yes. Having just been to Greece and talking about Socrates and getting told off, not for saying Socrates, it's like, well, you know who I'm talking about. It's the same person. Yeah, Thucydides, Pericles. Yeah.
Well, of course, that's modern Greek pronunciation. And
don't try that argument. Don't try that argument with a modern Greek that it's the modern Greek pronunciation. You'll get into real trouble. And I'm saying that.
And before we do,
revolution.
Mark, you're suggesting it's almost more a social revolution or a social
warfare revolution coming
changing.
Bringing in a more war-orientated society as such, but also bringing in the technology, the idea of chariots being brought into by the Mycenaeans into the Aegean, which Greece is not a chariot-friendly venue, really, and of course they are bringing it in because everybody else has got them. The Egyptians are using them, the Hittites are using them. They are what the cool kids have, so therefore never mind that their predecessors, the Minoans, are not interested in the least in that, because why would they be? They're a seaborne empire.
They do have linear A and B with not only chariots but with the components of chariots, which is weird. I think the funny thing there, of course, is that in many of our military revolutions at various points in time, chicken and egg arguments are made that the societal changes occur first and the warfare follows, or the opposite. No, the warfare changes happen first and then the societal, which came first, the hoplite or the demos. The idea that you have a military culture that reflects a sort of a greater enfranchisement of male citizens, or does hoplite warfare lead to a greater enfranchisement of male citizens? And the funny thing about both arguments is that the exponents of each are as vociferous as the other. No, you're wrong, I'm right. No, you're wrong, I'm right. And it's like, well, that's actually not helping. And the bizarre thing is that they very often bring up analogous arguments that, at no time in history has a warfare change brought about political change. It's always been a political change bringing about warfare change. And then the opposite argument is made as well. So very problematic and very, I think in many cases, the arguments of selecting the evidence that supports their argument, which of course is, as a historian, that's exactly the wrong thing that you should do.
Never happens.
Never happens. Not in the history of history has it ever happened.
Lindsay, did you have an example in mind for a revolution?
Oh, crikey. Well, mine was going to be a little bit more sort of like the 32,000 feet level. So my period is the Julio-Claudian, and I think the revolution, if there is one, is Augustus nationalizes the Roman army. He takes what effectively is a conscript army, or under Caesar, Crassus, and the other people, a private army, and he makes it a national one with terms and conditions and with regular pay, et cetera, but keeps its essential characteristics of its military combat doctrine and organization the same. But because of his, if you like, his fiscal and employment innovations, enables it to service an empire. And I think that's why it's a revolutionary thing.
And sort of arguably also still keeps it a private army.
Well, of course, yes, it swears sacramentum to him. But the analogy, and I know it's a financial one, is that in the days when, if you're old enough to remember client-server computing, a company called ICL, which was now being bought by Fujitsu, made an innovation, and it was not a technical innovation. It was not because they used smarter chipsets or smaller compact form factors. They changed how customers could buy the product. They offered them credit terms, and then they suddenly gained lots of market share. So that's a revolution or an evolution. And I'm looking at the military innovations in the same way. It can be the way we employ people. And again, so for example, Augustus extends the terms of service from 16 to 20 and ultimately 25. But there's that evocatus thing. It's hard to explain as well. The sort of reservists who get called back. And then the way they treat the auxiliaries. I mean, there's a massive build out of auxiliary units under Augustus, which I also think is revolutionary. That doesn't happen quite so much, but you can probably trace it all the way back to the Socii, the Federati in Italy and elsewhere. And they see this as being a clever way of actually building out the manpower and capability of the army without actually having to draw on all the people in Italy, because you could extend the franchise out to other parts of the empire. And by doing that, by employing Germans and Gauls, you kind of wrap them into the enterprise and make them less susceptible to revolutions in another kind, civil war type things, uprising. So I think those are equally revolutionary as much as all the other things we've talked about.
If I could put forward some revolution, maybe one that even ended the Bronze Age, it would be the infantryman, probably a chariot runner or someone who ran beside the chariots, the warrior elite of the late Bronze Age, that they discovered that they were actually able to take out the chariots, take out the horses with light throwing spears, take out the chariot warriors themselves encased in heavy bronze armor coats, that the infantrymen gained the supremacy over the chariot warrior that they didn't have. And while chariots didn't disappear after the end of the Bronze Age ended relatively abruptly in terms of like the civilizations in the Near East that came to an end, barring Egypt. Probably that's all somehow linked with the sea peoples that attacked many other civilizations, lots of disruptions, and it may be the advent of that infantryman who they discovered that they were actually superior in some ways, tactically superior, and they didn't necessarily have iron weapons. They used the same weapons they always did. It just maybe was a realization. If I could bring two, I don't know if I want to say revolutions, but two interesting aspects to changes in tactics. When the Athenians fought the Persians during the Persian Wars, they were not very well schooled in naval tactics. So they were much more of a boarding action type of fighters at sea. But after the Persian Wars, they put much emphasis on training, and they adopted what Thucydides would consider to have been advanced tactics, that is, ram, back away, ram again. And he makes note that the old style, unsophisticated tactics were just simply the boarding tactics. But the Athenians were undone when in the Peloponnesian War, when the Corinthians decided to put cat heads on their bows of their ships, ram them, the Athenian ships, straight forward, and they actually used older, unsophisticated tactics. I put unsophisticated in those invisible air quotes, to defeat the Athenians, or at least fight the Athenians to a standstill at the Battle of Veroneus. And in the Battle of the Great Harbor inside Syracuse, those same sort of blunt tactics were used to defeat the, at least initially more sophisticated ramming tactics of the Athenian navy. Fast forward to the Punic Wars, where the Romans were facing much more talented Carthaginian rowers, and their ships were sleeker and just better. But the Romans didn't see much percentage, let's say, in they didn't think that they could take on the Carthaginians in terms of rowing skill. But what they did do is they adopted the corvus, which evened up matters. So that actually changed the war at sea, as per Polybius, and turned naval actions into fights on land. That's the typical take on it. So that's a revolution in and of itself. Interestingly, as revolutionary as the corvus seems to have been, they're not mentioned again after the Battle of Ecnomus. Now, why that is, we don't know, but there was a revolution at sea, lasted for a few years, really, maybe from 260, when they were first employed at the Battle of Mylae, to the Battle of Ecnomus in 256, and we don't hear of them again. So they were revolutionary because it enabled the Romans to even things up during the First Punic War.
Well, essentially, though, it inspired probably someone like Marcus Agrippa to then come up with the corax and all these other clever things like collapsible towers. So it established an idea that you have to create a fighting platform somehow to reduce the advantage of the other side. So in the case of, let's say, Marcus Agrippa fighting Sextus Pompeius, he had bigger ships. Sextus Pompeius had little ships, very maneuverable ships. And he beat them because they had some of these other innovations, and then swapped that theory around when he came off to Actium by using smaller ships to beat the bigger ships, kind of thing.
But actually, what is interesting, what Mark pointed to, is that sometimes you get innovations and then they get superseded by another innovation, or which, in the case of the Athenian rowers in the 5th century are famous for being able to do complicated tactics, and that just is undone, it seems, by this innovation the Corinthians come up with first, of just making their rams and prows heavier so that they can do ram on ram ramming again, and this it makes boarding actions and more relevant again, and leads eventually to possibly to heavier ships like the quadrireme and the quinquireme. And then you get the Romans, who also sort of find a temporary innovation that disappears for no good for no reason that at least we know of. Weather has often been suggested that it makes a ship more top heavy and just goes topsy-turvy more easily. But it could also be because the Roman fleet system is very, what should we say, incidental. The fleets are built and admirals are appointed, and as soon as they're not needed anymore, they're just left to rot and knowledge disappears again. So that's it. Is sort of an example of the coming and going of innovations, though whether an innovation is a revolution is, I guess we never did really define what is a revolution.
Well, I'm just going to throw this at you then. It's interesting that you may not know this. Apparently, revolution comes from the Latin revolvere, which means to roll back. I didn't know that. But the interesting thing, I think, is that what it hints at is there's discussion and thought that goes into how will we develop technology or formations or some combination thereof to be able to gain tactical and strategic advantage over an opponent. So in other words, there's planning and strategy in the build-up to war. And I think, for example, in the Alpine War, 15 BC, which is when you really start to see the introduction of lorica segmentata, as we call it, right? Someone came up and said, we need a different kind of thing to address some of the shortcomings of chainmail. Someone must have come up with something like that, right? Because we find in Dankstetten the first kind of early examples, and then by the time we get to Kalkriese, it's clearly evolved into not just one but several different styles. So there's an ongoing discussion: how can we improve this? How can it be made more designed for manufacture, to use kind of modern manufacturing terminology? And I find that really intriguing, as there are whole discussions and people. I think it's going to be the Praefectus Fabrorum or the Orchestrorum, one of those two people, who are actually encouraging their armorers to think up new and clever ways. We need more. How can you make them faster? I got an idea. I saw it in the gladiator fight a couple of days ago, sort of thing. And all of this is invisible. None of this is documented. We have nothing to explain how this happens.
Some of those things you get wrong, which is very unusual. Like, for instance, the Manica was always described as a Trajanic Dacian war innovation. But it was designed to stop the Phalanx blows from the Dacians. You're like, but now we found some from a century earlier, and they're obviously on gladiators earlier than that. So clearly this modern, this is a revolution. You're like, no. So I think in terms of what you're saying, Lindsay, for me, the segue, it's the echelon phalanx of Epaminondas at the Battle of Leuctra, where he deliberately comes up with a tactic to target the strongest point of his enemy, this being the Spartan and the Spartan king, where the Spartan king is posted on the right, and therefore he posts his own strongest troops on his left, which is a change in thinking of where you put your best men. And then secondly, he draws up his phalanx in echelon so that the units to the right of his strongest unit don't necessarily need to engage, but they still threaten the enemy line, so they can't envelop, and he can attack at the point of greatest mass at his own choosing. Now that, of course, is not what you will get if you read Xenophon's account of the Battle of Leuctra. Xenophon doesn't mention any of that at all, and he talks about the depth of the Theban phalanx as being almost accidental. He talks about it being 50 deep. And there's been lots of modern studies on 50 deep's wasted. You're not going to get any additional benefit from a phalanx that deep. But the Theban phalanxes have traditionally been deeper, all the way back to the Battle of Delium, for instance. So 25 shields deep could quite easily be a more impactful phalanx than 8 or 16 or 12 deep.
But then again, sort of to paraphrase a question that we had from Carlos, are these revolutions really revolutions? I think he means, is it something that happens and then changes everything forever? Or is it a process again, or, a result of decades or centuries even of military leaders learning and adapting? And what you're saying, at least for the Theban phalanx, is that this is something that they've been doing for a while, and somebody just goes, you know what, I'll just go and make it even deeper, and then it stops after he dies.
Yeah, it's revolutionary for 15 years. I was coming to Lindsay's point about someone clearly thinking about, how do I overcome this? What's my what's my solution to this perceived problem on the battlefield? And I think, again, the depth of the phalanx is something that Thebans have a history of. So it's not the depth of the phalanx. You'll find lots of histories of the development of warfare that the depth of the Theban phalanx is a revolution, but it's got a 50-year history before it happens at Leuctra. And then, of course, the Macedonian phalanx thereafter has a deeper depth than the traditional hoplite phalanx, or does it? Because its traditional depth is 16 men, and you do have phalanxes of that deep. It can be doubled to 32 men, which is a deeper phalanx, but doesn't generally go into battle in 32 depth. He marches in 32 depth and then spreads out to 16. That's the Battle of Issus. If you hadn't have made that choice at the Battle of Leuctra, for instance, would the result have been a victory for the Thebans in quite the same way? So you can almost say, if it hadn't have gone the way it went, it wouldn't have been regarded as a revolution. So it's very much down to the fickle hand of fate. It's like, that's a revolution because it succeeded on that date. Tomorrow wouldn't have worked, so we wouldn't be talking about it.
So this is all part of the theory of innovation, right? That innovation is littered with failed inventions and developments, right? It's the ones that work we generally know about and actually reproduce. So again, the frustration is having the kind of sources that we have where these kinds of details are mostly omitted because ancient readers weren't interested, sadly.
And you've also got a very conservative bunch in terms of, I'm just sort of thinking in terms of the Romans, generation after generation, it's a very slow process. And you might have somebody like Caesar decide that actually on his Gallic campaigns, he's going to make a night attack, tell them to only take the Pugios, and we're going to sneak up and use this particular tactic, or on another day I'm going to load the 10th Legion onto cavalry and actually use them as a mobile legion of sorts. That's the ones that we've got, documented, but you've got to imagine that all the evolution of, say, the Roman legion, for example, from the early days of the Republic through to the later, there is going to be a lot that, what we hear from Polybius in terms of the early legion is a huge difference to what we see in terms of the late Republic going into Augustan period. But you've probably got along the way a lot of generals doing a lot of trying out, but then when legion is handed over to the next commander, because of course each of these provincial commands is only usually going to be 1 to 2 years, you've got a lot of reversion to what are our traditional tactics as such, what is our traditional drill. So it's going to take a long time for things to seed in.
Well, that's why you rely totally on the centurions, and that's why you also rely on this, I think, underappreciated Praefectus Castrorum, the guy who gets the camp organized and the army on the march and supply chains.
But speaking of the centurions, Lindsay, I mean, if you think about it, the traditional story is that early on the Romans also had a phalanx, and then there's the big innovation, possibly revolutionary, of dividing this army into all these subunits that are able to move individually because they all have their individual commanders. Of course, newer interpretations of early Roman warfare say that the Romans never really had a phalanx, but it was always these sort of clusters of clans with clan leaders, and that sort of formalized into the manipular legion, in which case it's just a long development, and the Romans just sort of naturally came up with a different kind of tactic that worked very well over time, and it wasn't a revolution at all.
Well, this always hints at what I think Murray was saying earlier about the politics, the social things, and the warfare. I mean, you in the regal period, it may well be influenced by Etruscans and Greek war theory. You'd use phalanges, is that what it is? But then as you become a republic from 509 and class differences matter much more, then you deploy a class-based war army.
I don't think you're going to get, though, from what we're sort of seeing now in terms of the research going through, that class, the battle of the classes that you have in your traditional telling of the Roman historical story is something that probably comes in a lot later. And it, as Jesper was just saying, the clan-based system is probably where you get your original origins of the Legion from. And again, it's going to be, you will get your influences from your Etruscans or your Samnite culture, because by that stage, the Romans are still taking in, the likes of the Claudii coming in as an entire clan being introduced. And if we're reading it right in terms of people like the Fabii being a prime example of a clan army, then if you're taking it that the Claudii would have something similar, they'll be bringing in different tactics into it, which will influence that development as well.
But my understanding is, for example, when the citizenry turns out on the Campus Martius and is selected by lot, they're basically in their political centuria, their political centuries, right? So those political centuries are, to your point, I suppose they're clan-based, but they're larger than that. They're centuries. So it's an odd Roman hybrid. It's wonderful we can explore all this because we don't know enough about it, and there's the frustration, right?
Yeah, one of those basic questions: why is a century not a century? Well, how long have you got? Okay, because they were, then they weren't, then they were, then they weren't, then they were smaller, but then they were larger, and then we eventually enter on 80. But we keep the word century for all of them. I mean, in Greek terms, it's the lokos, right?
It's not as bad, at least, as the political situation where they again use the word century in terms of political voting groups. And of course, that is massive. Never mind your 80 in an army. The abuse of that word is phenomenal.
Is that revolutionary? But the question really is there anything that is that really is like it's introduced and then nothing is ever the same again? In ancient military history, I suppose that's what we're really after.
Well, could you say in terms of perhaps the training? I mean, sorry, sticking with the Romans here, but of course, some of the training that is brought in I think I'm right in saying third century, or second century. Third century, I'm sure. You've got the introduction of training of, in terms of more like the gladiatorial element of sword play. You could say that as revolutionary in terms of influencing the style of battle.
And the other aspect, extending that theory, I like that theory, is the idea again is that we think of a monolithic Roman army, but in fact it's an army group of a province. So it's a Mauritanian, it's a German, it's a Macedonian army. And to some degree, they develop, I'm sure, cultures and doctrines which are unique to their theatre of war and the tradition of those legions which have been there 150 years. So the British army, the Executus Britannicus, I suppose, will probably have things that make it slightly different than the one in Mysia.
I don't want to bring up the Batavians again, but the Batavians, the idea that they're the swimming soldiers, which they monopolize, which probably they didn't. There were other swimming auxiliaries, and then Auxilia Platina and things like that.
They were just bigger and blonder.
Bigger and blonder. They were the ones who stood out. And again, you get that idea that they're still called the Batavians into the 5th century. We've got many units of Batavians mentioned in the Notitia. Are they still all from the homelands of the Batavi? Probably not, but they're still called that. And probably the unit has a history of doing a particular thing. And therefore, whether you're from Batavia or not, you're going to do the thing that your unit is renowned for and trained for, regardless of whether you're actually any good at it in the first instance. So there's that sort of idea. And you see that in later armies too, where, traditions of particular units are kept, even when the initial reason for them has long since dissolved.
Is that revolutionary? It's certainly interesting. I don't think we've talked much about sort of history or unit identity over time as that might have been understood in the ancient world. That I suppose that really comes in with the imperial legions that get names and that refer to the previous events and victories.
There's a really interesting idea with the Batavians, that you start to get inscriptional evidence of people coming into that unit who were not born, and they're recruited outside of those regions, and even Batavians who are recruited into other units that are not Batavian cohorts. And again, I think one of the advantages of the Roman imperial period is that we actually have such a wealth of inscriptional evidence, which allows us to do that. Whereas when you go back to earlier periods, much less information survives, so you can't really draw conclusions in that sense.
That takes you back to the recruitment of the Legion as well, in terms of saying extending it outside the citizenship of Italy as such, and especially when you get to Caesar, who is making legions out of Gallic troops, who he is deeming that he has personally given them citizenship to enroll his own legions. But again, that is a revolution in terms of the makeup and the origins of the Roman legion, which obviously, going forward, is a point from which there is no return in Roman history.
And in the same vein, I mean, Marius making the decision at Vercella basically to recognize the Italian allies as Roman citizens is in fact in violation of Roman law, which then has to be dealt with and ends up with a was it 4 or 5 year long war to reconcile that issue. And then that itself is a revolution, which then means that all Italians effectively are recognized as Roman citizens.
Or going to away from the Romans, again, going back to the Macedonians, in the same vein, Alexander getting back from his eastern campaigns and trying to introduce Persians into the Macedonian ranks as phalangites. That is one that, it's a failed revolution, but it's, it has repercussions that are far-reaching.
It's interesting that the revolution, in terms of Marius, is given credit to him, that he's the one who ignores the property qualification. So he's the one who, enlists the proletariat. And yet we know that there are early examples under the, in the 2nd century where that's happening. And yet still the Roman historians credit Marius with it. And they give him a specific date for it in his first consulship in 107.
And now we've said that the Marian Revolution really isn't.
Well, my guess is this. It probably is, again, he had somebody like a Plutarch to write about him, and he was drawing evidence out of the autobiography of Marius. So as long as you can get hold of the book, whatever's written in the book is what you use to spin the story. And if you didn't have that book available, I'm thinking of Livy, for example, he's out in the burbs of Italy somewhere, rather than Rome, so no big library available. So you repeat what you've got available to you.
Mark, you wanted to add something?
It occurs to me that there can be a revolution not on the basis of some sort of introduced technology or tactic, but on the basis of what you no longer need. And that is, once the Romans controlled the entirety of the Mediterranean littoral, the whole of the seaboard, they didn't truly have to worry about pirates or a major competitor and maintain an enormous fleet to go after them the way they did against the Carthaginians. Now, they still did have fleets. They had the fleet based at 2 fleets in Italy.
Misenum and Ravenna.
Right, Ravenna and Misenum. They had a fleet in the Channel. But otherwise, the naval warfare was not the major concern of Rome until really Carthage, North Africa fell to the Vandals in the very first, the early part of the 5th century AD, and the vulnerability of Roman cities to attack by the sea can be shown in that there was that epic raid conducted in the Mediterranean by Gauls. I want to say it was around in the 260s AD that they attacked Athens and then supposedly made it all the way through the Pillars of Hercules.
Goths, not Gauls.
Well, Goths. Goths, and they made it all the way back to their homeland and told their stories. But there wasn't really a very large force, in any of these places to contend with the Goths, and that's an interesting part. That was a revolution, though. Maybe let's call it a negative revolution.
Yeah, and oddly enough, of course, with, as Lindsay mentioned, the nationalization of the Roman army, if that's a new term that we coined today, I guess. But but that innovation also comes the nationalization of those fleets, because there are no fleets in being before that either. I mean, there are fleets during the Civil Wars, but not on a basis like Augustus found. But on that bombshell, I think we have ranged about 2,000 years today. I hope people have been able to follow along with our discussion. I think this is a topic we could definitely come back to at some point, but that will be for
So
another
we have to
podcast.
choose a revolution. We have to choose a revolution and then go that one and discuss the single revolution each time.
Well, maybe we'll have to ask if, our patrons for suggestions for which revolution that should be. Until then, see you soon. Bye-bye.